Welcome to another edition of Diplomatic Channel. I'm Amarachi Ubani. Russian authorities have finally confirmed that Wagner paramilitary chief Yevgeny Prigozhin didn't die in the plane crash of August 24. The investigative committee said they confirmed he was on the plane, a private jet, alongside 9 other people. But the government denies he had anything to do with the crash. On the program, we explore Russia's involvement in the crash and international response. Now, the Russian war in Ukraine continues, and as far as we know, Russia has not renewed the grain deal signed with Ukraine and initiated by the UN and Turkey in July last year. Even worse, attacks in recent weeks have threatened any shipment of grains out of Ukraine. Days after Russia announced its withdrawal from the deal in July, I had a chat with Ukrainian journalist and co-founder and CEO, Public Interest Journalism Lab, Natalia Gumenyuk, on what life has been like in Ukraine since the war, and especially since Russia's withdrawal of the deal. Later on the program, leaders take away from the BRICS summit in South Africa. That's Diplomatic Channel in a wrap. A quick check on other discussions in diplomatic circles, and we'll be right back. The Nigerian Ministry of Foreign Affairs has debunked as fake news that the Nigerian government has expelled its ambassador to the country. The ministry was reacting to news gone viral that Ambassador Muhammad Sani Usman was on Friday, August 25th, expelled and given 48 hours to leave the country. A statement released by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs urges the public to disregard the information as false and warned against the circulation of unverified information capable of jeopardizing ongoing mediation efforts by ECOWAS in the political impasse in Niger. Meanwhile, Nigerian President Bola Tinubu has received letters of credence from the ambassador of the Federal Republic of Ethiopia, Mr. Awal Mohammed, ambassador of the Republic of Cuba, Mrs. Miriam Palmero, and ambassador of the United Arab Emirates, Salem Al-Shamsi. Speaking with each separately and with the ambassador from Ethiopia, President Tinubu said Africans need to work for the progress of Africa, and Africa should be able to resolve its internal problems. He commended the envoy from Cuba for the nation excelling in the advancement of indigenous medical sciences and accessible health care at the grassroots, while ensuring the stability of their surrounding region. And with the UAE ambassador, President Tinubu directed that issues affecting relations with the Emirates airline and issuance of visas to Nigerians be resolved immediately, emphasizing his resolve to personally intervene if needed.
Conscient des dérives que peuvent engendrer les fausses informations,
the Gabonese government blocked internet access and imposed a curfew on Saturday after a general election marked by major voting delays, as the opposition cried foul over a poll they hoped would halt President Ali Bongo's bid to extend his family's 56-year grip on power. The Central African nation was holding presidential, legislative and local polls simultaneously for the first time, with tensions running high amid fears electoral system changes could sow doubt about the legitimacy of the results and provoke unrest. The 64-year-old Bongo, who succeeded his father Omar in 2009, is seeking a third term against 18 challengers, 6 of whom backed a joint nominee in an effort to narrow the race.
Puissent susciter des désagréments, mais elles sont prises dans l'intérêt supérieur de notre nation.
That very few people.
Finally, Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa has won another term in office, following an electoral process on Thursday last week. The president gained 52.6% of the vote, according to the Electoral Commission. The opposition, however, claims to have won the poll, citing widespread vote rigging. Observers say the poll fell short of democratic standards. Mnangagwa is the country's third president. Known as the Crocodile when he first assumed office in 2017, he promised the people a new start. He also vowed to guarantee human rights. Observers say little appears to have changed in the country as inflation remains high and poverty and climate fear remains.
I think this is what we should, as Zimbabweans, cherish.
Welcome back. I guess it's safe now to say Wagner boss Yevgeny Prigozhin is dead. At least that's what the Russian government would like us to believe. On Sunday, Russian Investigative Committee spokeswoman Svetlana Petrenko announced in an audio broadcast as part of the investigation of the plane crash in the Tver region, molecular genetic examinations have been completed. According to their results, the identities of all 10 dead were established. They correspond to the list stated in the flight sheet. It's the first time since the crash on Wednesday that the government has confirmed Prigozhin's death. Even when President Vladimir Putin reacted to the news on Thursday, he never confirmed nor denied that the Wagner leader was dead, choosing instead to offer condolences to the family and remembering him in terms of the friendship they shared.
The Russian president sent his condolences to family of the Wagner Group leader Yevgeny Prigozhin on Thursday, breaking his silence after the mercenary leader's plane crashed with no survivors, 2 months after he led a mutiny against army chiefs. President Putin confirmed he had known Prigozhin for a very long time, describing him as a man with a complicated fate who made serious mistakes in his life. He said he achieved the results he needed both for himself and for the common cause. He had only learned of the plane crash on Thursday morning, assuring that a preliminary investigation would be launched into the incident. On Wednesday, while news about the crash made headlines by evening, the Russian president, who was attending the BRICS summit virtually, addressed the summit, thanking his South African counterpart Cyril Ramaphosa for handling the summit and for his efforts to expand the bloc. Those who claim to have witnessed the crash said they heard a loud bang before seeing the jet fall from the sky. The plane crashed near the village of Kozhenkino on its way from Moscow to St. Petersburg. A telegram linked to Wagner, known as Grey Zone, pronounced Prigozhin dead, but also hailed him as a hero and patriot, claiming that he died at the hands of unidentified people it called traitors to Russia. Western suggestions that Prigozhin was killed on the Russian government's orders were shot down by the Kremlin as an absolute lie. Some unidentified officials who were quoted in the media suggested that the plane explosion appears to be vengeance for the Wagner mutiny in June, which posed the biggest challenge to President Vladimir Putin's 23-year rule. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov rejected the allegations as a complete lie. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded to news of the plane crash and Prigozhin's death at a news conference in Kyiv, where he was hosting the Portuguese president Marcelo Rebelo de Sousa, saying Ukraine was not involved in the accident.
All right.
The U.S. said there was no current information to suggest that a surface-to-air missile took down the plane.
I know there's a lot of interest in this topic. I'll say right up front, first of all, our initial assessment is that it's likely Prigozhin was killed. We're continuing to assess the situation. We don't have any information to indicate right now the press reporting stating that there was some type of surface-to-air missile that took down the plane. We assess that information to be inaccurate. Again, nothing to indicate and no information to suggest that there was a surface-to-air missile. But beyond that, I'm really just not going to have any further information.
The late Prigozhin was mourned in Russia. Flowers were laid and candles lit on Friday at a makeshift Wagner Group memorial in St. Petersburg. Even in faraway Niger Republic in Africa, where Wagner forces are rumored to be cooperating with the army even more after the coup, pro-Russia activists expressed grief. Prigozhin's name and influence are widespread throughout Africa, with pro-Wagner imagery having become mainstays of pro-coup and anti-Western protests in Mali, Burkina Faso, and most recently, Niger Republic. Prigozhin admitted in September 2022 that he had founded the private military group in 2014, the year Russia annexed Crimea from Ukraine. The group has fought in Libya, Syria, the Central African Republic and Mali, among other countries. In the meantime, a group of Russian militants who fight on the Ukrainian side have released a video in which they called on the Wagner Group to switch sides and join their rank to revenge the death of their founder.
For those who do not know, the Wagner Group, officially known as the Wagner Private Military Company, is a Russian state-funded private military company controlled by Yevgeny Prigozhin. That was until his death last week. Reports suggest Wagner has been used as a proxy by the Russian government, allowing it to have plausible deniability for military operations abroad and hiding the true casualties of Russia's foreign interventions. Russia has employed the help of Wagner in its war in Donbass, Ukraine, and the group has played a significant role in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, for which it recruited Russian prison inmates for the frontline combat. Speaking of Ukraine and the war going on there, you may have noticed the wheat prices going up from around the world from the month of July. And that's because around this time, well, even probably before, but around this time, the deal brokered between Russia and Ukraine by the United Nations and Turkey was called off by Russia. Russia pulled out of the deal, and more than half of that grain, the 32.9 million metric tons exported since August last year, a month after the deal was signed, had reached developing countries. The grains were loaded into vessels in Ukrainian ports before navigating a pre-planned route through the Black Sea, which is heavily mined by Ukraine and Russian forces. The vessels crossed the Black Sea towards Turkey's Bosphorus Strait, while being closely monitored by a joint coordination center in Istanbul, containing representatives from the UN, Ukraine, Russia, and Turkey. The aim was to ensure Ukrainian and Russian grain would get to countries who needed them, as Russia and Ukraine are major producers of global grain, which have been greatly affected by the war in Ukraine. Russia had been saying for months, though, the conditions for the deal's extension had not been fulfilled, some of which include the ending of sanctions on the Russian Agricultural Bank, the resumption of supplies of the Togliatti-Odessa ammonia pipeline, and the unblocking of assets and accounts of Russian companies involved in food and fertilizer exports. With no response coming from any of the parties involved, Russia ended the deal on July 20, 2023. I had a chat with Ukrainian journalist and co-founder and CEO, Public Interest Journalism Lab, Natalia Gumenyuk, about this and more. Joining me now is Natalia Gumenyuk. She is a founder, CEO, Public Interest Journalism Lab in Ukraine. Natalia, thank you for joining me on Diplomatic Channel, and welcome to Nigeria.
Thank you. I really enjoyed here.
And how long have you been in the country? Is this your first time visiting?
So in Nigeria and in the West Africa, it's the first time, so I'm merely for a couple of days. I've been to Africa before, though, but still I understand, Nigeria is a huge country to explore, so a couple of days is a bit too little.
Yes, and how do you find, people's awareness about what's going on in Ukraine? I'm sure you had a few conversations, with some individuals about it, and they have bared their minds on, what they think about the Russia-Ukraine crisis.
I'm positively surprised. I wonder, was it an accident? Because just while crossing the border through the migration service, the bodyguard was asking me to send the greetings and ask about the President Zelensky, and was really, full of support and solidarity, giving the sign that, he'll pray for Ukraine. It was pretty surprising, but I'm also very much surprised positively with the local journalists with whom I had a chance to interact, knowing that the stories, knowing the names of the Ukrainian towns. I do understand that Ukraine can be very far away from Africa, but I see that a lot connects us, whether that would be the students studying in Ukraine or the whole story with the Ukrainian grain coming to Africa. So there are more things to relate.
Yes, and just, you know, to provide some context, you live in Kyiv, right, the Ukrainian capital. What is life there like?
So I live in Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, and I do report from various corners of the country. Ukraine is not that big, still a vast country, so situation is different in different areas. Capital was luckily defended during the first months of the war, so we managed to move on to more or less normal life. However, there is this always risk of the missile attacks in particular civilian infrastructure. By this I mean, you know, the electricity grid, power station, but also civilian objects. So it's really a bit like there is a constant threat, as if it's like the normal life, you reclaimed it, you try to, you know, even celebrate this life with schools open, subway working, you know, restaurant, businesses trying to live. However, there is this always unexpected threat, like from the terrorist attack, probably something to relate. So even like in this southern town of Odessa, where there is this port famous for, for being the place from where the Ukrainian grain is moving towards different continents, you know, it was a seaside town for holidays. But unfortunately, after the recent days, it kind of shelled every night. So it's, again, like I think it's unfortunately a bit schizophrenic. We're trying to live as normal life as possible, not to give up, but there is always a constant threat. However, there are more badly damaged areas of the country, especially those which are under the Russian occupation.
We'll have more on my conversation with Natalia after the break. Stay with us. Let's talk very quickly about the grain deal now, which is, well, in limbo because Russia pulled out. The Ukrainian president says he wants the UN and Turkey to continue. How much of Ukrainian grain has been hurt by Russia pulling out of this deal? Do you know what are other media in Ukraine reporting about this and how this impacts on the country?
So I was particularly in the role, I was hosting the group of the senior editors and reporters from African countries a bit more than a week ago, and exactly reporting the story of the grain deal. So we went to Odessa, we went to Mykolaiv, we talked to the people, and we were interviewing the president. So the president firmly said that we would, we would still negotiate with the UN and Turkey. But it was right after that the ports in Odessa and Mykolaiv were constantly shelled for the last week, including harming, you know, real grain. What is important to understand, what we learned, that of course there is a lot of effort to put and find the ways to bring the grain from Ukraine to various countries. I underestimated myself, and I think we as Ukrainians, how much of the grain Ukraine produces. We have our own issues. We didn't really understand how much is consumed outside of Ukraine. Ukraine produces way more grain than it's needed. But it's really hard to deliver now. So there are now alternative routes developed. It's very hard because the sea is still the cheapest. And, you know, to do it through the land, through the trains, it's really becoming more expensive. But what is most important that also the African colleagues, they met a lot of Ukrainian farmers, and they understood that a lot of territories are remained, you know, mined. For the Ukrainian farmers, it's extremely expensive now to produce grain because it was cheap to deliver. Now it's very expensive to deliver. So even the grain is not that expensive for Ukraine. For the Ukrainian farmers, it's very expensive to produce it because there is no profit almost. So there should be more long-lasting approach to understand that, of course, the Ukraine should retain its territory, demine its territory, to produce more grain for future, you know, to be sure that in 2024, in 2025, there would be enough of Ukrainian grain to move. Because the issue is not just about the logistic and delivering, but really having. So far we have enough, but in a couple of years we won't. That's why Ukrainians are also, you know, arguing for the liberation of the territories, because unless the Black Sea is unblocked, unless the Ukraine control its its ports unless it has, its own territory, especially the south part of it is occupied, which is the place where a lot of grain is growing. Then that could cause the problems in few years.
Natalia, very quickly, Ukraine wants to join NATO. This is a problem for Russia. The excuse it's given to invade Ukraine. And then NATO allies is saying, well, we won't talk about membership until things settle down in Ukraine. What are your thoughts?
I think there is some lack of courage in terms of our international partners. The Germany was accepted to NATO 10 years after the Second World War in 1950s. So what is said to be impossible, that's possible. For Ukraine, the major concern is, till now, Ukraine remained neutral. It was not in any part of the alliance. The war Ukraine is, the reason why it's invaded, it's also because, the countries which are not the members of the alliance cannot defend themselves. So that's probably the biggest reason why we don't see another way. I think this conflict is really about the rules. It's also about the nuclear power. So there are a lot of different things which are happening which should be discussed internationally and globally.
Natalia, I appreciate you joining me on the program today. Thank you so much for making time to be with me. We welcome you to Nigeria. You're welcome any other time you decide to come, and safe travels back to Ukraine.
Thank you.
Finally, on Diplomatic Channel, BRICS leaders headed back over the weekend, having fortified friendships, revitalized old ones, and welcomed new countries into its fold. And no, Nigeria is not one of them. According to the Vice President, Mr. Kashim Shettima, Nigeria did not apply for BRICS membership.
This year's BRICS summit in Johannesburg, South Africa had all but one of all BRICS leaders in attendance. Representatives from at least 23 countries were also attending, including Nigeria's Vice President, Mr. Kashim Shettima. Russian President Vladimir Putin had decided to remain in Moscow to attend the meetings virtually. He had sent Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov in his place. China and Russia looked forward to reinforcing BRICS amid heightened tensions resulting from the war in Ukraine and Beijing's growing rivalry with Washington. But Brazilian President Lula da Silva said the grouping should not seek to rival the United States and Group of 7 wealthy economies. During his address to the BRICS on Wednesday, the Russian president said Moscow will use its chairmanship of BRICS next year to strengthen the group's role in the world and will host a summit in the city of Kazan in October 2024. He said he will promote the further realization of BRICS Economic Partnership Strategy to 2025 and the development of the new long-term cooperation roadmaps. One of them is strengthening the role of countries in the international currency and fiscal system, development of interbank cooperation, expansion of national currency usage, and deepening cooperation in taxation, customs and antitrust activities. He also told the summit that Russia wanted to end a war he said had been unleashed by the West and its satellites in Ukraine. The Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi kicked off discussions on the issue of expansion for member states, saying he fully supports the move. He said India welcomes moving forward on this based on consensus. He reminded the group that back in 2016, during India's presidency of the group, the country had defined BRICS as a group building responsive, inclusive and collective solutions, and that BRICS will be breaking barriers, revitalizing economics, inspiring innovation, creating opportunities and shaping the future.
7 साल बाद हम कह सकते हैं कि BRICS will be
Chinese President Xi Jinping called for the acceleration of the expansion of the BRICS group. He asked the group to allow more countries to join the family, pool wisdom and gather strength to make a global governance more fair and reasonable. He said BRICS countries should be peers on the road of development and revitalization and oppose acts of decoupling, disrupting industrial and supply chains, as well as economic coercion.
反对脱钩断链。
He also announced that China's financial institutions will soon launch a special fund of $10 billion to implement the Global Development Initiative, increasing cooperation with African countries, including providing a complete set of data products for satellite mapping.
人工智能治理框架和标准规范。
The Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva said he wanted to see the African Union eventually joining the bloc. BRICS leaders spent more time weighing rules for admitting new members to the bloc. Host South Africa's president said there were concerns about global financial and payment systems.
We are concerned that global financial and payment systems are increasingly being used as instruments of geopolitical contestation. Global economic recovery relies on predictable global payment systems and the smooth operating of banking, supply chains, trade, tourism, as well as financial flows. We will continue discussions on practical measures to facilitate trade and investment flows through the increased use of local currencies.
In the end, the BRICS countries decided to invite 6 countries, Argentina, Egypt, Iran, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, to become new members of the bloc. Nigeria, Africa's largest economy, was not on the list.
So far, we have not applied for the membership of BRICS, fundamentally informed by the fact that my principal, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, is a true democrat that believes in consensus building. There are so many variables that need to be taken into cognizance. We have to evaluate so many tendencies, issues, and scope that requires engagements with the Economic Advisory Council, with the Federal Executive Council, and even with the National Assembly before an informed decision towards joining the BRICS will be taken.
One of the major speakers at the summit this year was the UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres, who stated the importance of cooperation, saying there is simply no alternative to it. He urged leaders to restore trust and reinvigorate multilateralism for the 21st century, a move he says requires courage to compromise in the reforms necessary for the common good.
We've come to the end of the program today. I hope it's been helpful and informative. Tell us what you think. You can reach me using any of the addresses showing on your screen. On Instagram, it's at Amarachi Ubani. On X, it's at Amarachi_Ubani. And on Facebook, Ubani Amarachi. I'll see you next time.